It's a lot of pressure. Okay, so we are continuing on with our study from last week, and this is how to have a servant's heart, basically, something like that. Forget what I titled it, but how to have a servant's heart, or the heart of a servant. So we want to take a model from the book of Joshua. So we're going to go to Matthew's gospel. How about that? So we're eventually going to get to Joshua, but we're going to get there kind of quickly because it'll take us a little time in Joshua. We're going to cover the entire book. We're basically going to look at the chapter divisions a little bit, kind of like the chapter divisions in the book of Joshua. Take four principles from that and try to discover then how to have a servant's heart. But I just wanted to go back, even though we laid a lot of foundational kind of material last week from that. So if you missed that, just kind of go back on the YouTube channel and pick up last week, and you'll get all that background material. But I want to just by way of review, if I could just do a little bit of a synopsis on this idea of a servant. Let's go to Matthew chapter 3, ever so briefly, tie in a bunch of passages here, and I found a neat little nugget in Luke chapter 1 as well, and just throw this all together in kind of like a mashup. How do you like that? Yeah, a mashup. But this is Matthew 3, and I thought about this, and this is a scene, of course, with Jesus' baptism. Matthew 3:15, Jesus answering said unto them, "Permit it at this time," or "permit it, suffer it to be so," the old translation, right? Suffer it to be so. Just let it be so, John. Talking to John the Baptist. Just let it be so, for in this way it's fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he, that is John the Baptist, and he permitted him, is to baptize him. So it's a sense of, we have this sense of resignation. We have this sense of surrender, this kind of thing. And this takes us back then to just tying these passages together really, really, really quickly, right? John chapter 13 and verse 4, and we find then a different scene. And in this scene, Jesus is what? He is himself demonstrating the role of a servant, because he is put this towel around himself, and he's doing what? He's washing the disciples' feet. Mark chapter 10, probably if you backed up in the reading to verse 23 and following, but we're just jumping to verse 45. I didn't come to be served. I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. But then he says, in that context, he says, if you want to be the greatest of all, then become a slave. If you want to be greatest, well, serve. If you want to be first, be a slave, something like that. But you can read that two different words. One to serve, diakonos, one to serve at tables, the other doulos, to be a bond slave. And won't go into all that detail again, except to say, then how did Jesus self-identify? Philippians 2, 7 and 8, he self-identified as a doulos, that is, as a servant of God. That is, he came basically to void himself of self. If that makes any sense, whatever. But the sort of like the image that we are to get from all of this is, to properly serve God, we have to be void of self. And that's basically the high watermark right there, to be void of self. That's the idea of a doulos. That's the idea of a bond slave, is someone who says, I don't have any rights, I don't have any. And I just challenge you and me to figure that out. Like in reality, what is that? That's the ongoing challenge. So Jesus says then to us, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. We've looked at that. Paul said, I'm a doulos, and then he challenged the believers in Rome in 12, 1 and 2 of Romans to climb up on the altar, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and so on. Then I came across this passage. Is this fast enough for us? Then I came across this passage. Think about this. Luke chapter 1 and verse 38, and then we'll jump into the book of Joshua. This one is interesting. Okay, Luke 1:30, not that the others aren't, but Luke 1:38. Just see what you think of this one. So doulos, we're used to hearing this. Doulos. But what about the feminine version of that? What about the feminine? Doulé. Dule. How about we just fly with this one? And we have this actually with Mary. And now here's the whole infancy, well, not even infancy narrative, but the whole birth narrative of Jesus. And Mary said, remember this with the angels, basically telling her, Mary, God is about, I use this term, I don't know if I use it here, but this term, never fear the wrecking ball of God. You know, I love this. I love this term. I don't love it happening, but when God brings the wrecking ball on your life, right? I mean, this is the idea of, you know, the voiding of the self. But what happens when God just brings a wrecking ball and just, you know, right? So this is what's happening to Mary, right? You know, right? Her whole world is about to come, let's say, come crashing down, but from our point of view. But here, what the angel is pronouncing that's going to happen to Mary, you know, what's going to happen to Mary is nothing short of just complete and utter disruption. It is a intersection of her will, right? It's just an intersection of it. It's not a parallel, you know, God doesn't come in along parallel with our will. And I say, well, let me just see, you know, let me just see. Well, I think we can find agreement here. No, God just flat intersects it, doesn't he? He just cuts right across it. And that's what happens with Mary. But notice what she says. Mary said, behold, the doule, not doulos, because this is feminine, right? This is feminine. Behold, the doule of the Lord. But it's the same principle, right? It's the same. What she's saying is, hey, listen, I don't have any rights. I don't have any hold on my life. What difference does it make? If this is what God wants, I belong to him. Let him do whatever he wants, right? And isn't that what the rest of it says? May it be done to me according to your word. And the word there is not logos, it's rhema. The idea is what I just heard you say. What I just heard you say, let it be. Let it be that. And the angel Lord departed from him. So you'd read this sort of like, behold, the bondslave of the Lord. And then if you bracketed something, I'm not saying do this, but if you bracketed, you'd almost say, therefore. In other words, because I am God's bondslave, because I have no rights, because I have no will to exercise of my own. Let me put it this way. Because I have lost all self-determination. Therefore, whatever you say must be. Now, this is in terms of God. But this is believing then that God has my best interests, but then that's conditional. That's sort of like saying, well, since God has my, but that's like banking everything on the attributes of God. But this is just God. God flat out being sovereign and God being in control. There it is. I'm his bondslave. I think this is an amazing verse, really. It's an amazing verse, but I just wanted to point that out when she says, well, I'm God's servant, you know, I'm you know. She's going all in on God. And this is the notion. I don't think we quite grasp that. And I mean that not in a judgmental sense. I just mean that in a very real sense that at the very root, I think, of the idea of following Christ, it just comes to terms with this notion, not of serving, because that's doing, but of being a servant, which is being. I think the idea of doing, there's plenty of people that are just trying to do to exhaustion. But being, that's the heavier lift. And this is the idea of following Christ, is to void of self and to be in this position of becoming Christ-like. And then remember last week we said, well, what is that? What is that? That's becoming a servant of God. So a servant of God. And then when I that's a heart thing, right? Isn't that a heart thing? That's an attitude. That's an attitude of coming to him and saying complete trust complete resignation of the self, a sense of, I will not factor myself into this equation whatsoever. Doesn't this parallel us coming to Christ initially for salvation? Doesn't it even parallel that whatsoever? Of course it does. How did we factor into that equation at all? We didn't. So anyway, we come to the book of Joshua, and this functions like a spiritual roadmap to us. And if you follow it, you will have this servant's heart. Now, for example, if you go, we go to the end of Joshua, and if you recall, he says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua is saying this because he can. In other words, of the people of God, he is the only one who's qualified. So he's saying, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, right? And that's sort of the people at this time are saying, oh, sure, and we're going to do it as well. Yes, we will, sure. And he's saying, no, you'll not be able to serve the Lord. No, you can't, because there's an impediment to that. And he goes to point that out. He's talking about in terms of idolatry. There's something standing in the way, and so on. So this is a roadmap here that has a beginning and an ending point. To begin the journey, you must take a step of faith, and the entire journey then is a preparation for the ending point, which is the destination. So the destination is to be a servant of God. This is the destination. And so the destination is what you are becoming along the way. So in other words, the journey is making you into a servant. And without the journey, there is no servant. And without the beginning, there is no servant. Now remember, last week we looked into Israel's history, and we said, well, there's really like three things that proved to be sort of chronic ailments that preempted them in becoming, having this, if you remember, passages like Deuteronomy chapter, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This sort of fourfold thing. And that's the heart of a servant, and they failed every time because of delay, because of, running away due to opposition, because of rebelling against him and failing. So we need to kind of walk this journey from beginning to end by looking briefly at these 4 points on the roadmap, keeping in mind there's a goal or a destination. We have to keep this in mind as believers always. I mean, what's the point? What's the goal? And so if we're not thinking this way every single day of our lives, I mean, what is the goal? What is the point? Why am I drawing breath today? Who am I? Who am I? This is a great question to ask to start the day. Who am I? It's not your job. It's not some human relationship. It is, you could say I'm a child of God, or I'm a Christian, or I'm something like that. But I'm a servant of God, and that puts me, how many times did God say, this person, my servant, this person, my servant, this person, my servant? This is how God looks. This is his expectation. So God wants our hearts right before him, that we've abandoned self, and that we vacated this, and we are available to him. So let's look at each of these 4 points, if you will. We could call them sort of geographic locations on this roadmap, as though they are action statements if we want to become God's servants, which we do, which we must. This is what God. So I would say the first one, this is Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 through 5:12. This thing. We're not taking this exegetically, like you can go through every single verse and say, oh, where can I find all these principles in there? We're taking this like a big flyover and saying, well, what does this whole section tell us? If we had to put like a metaphorically or analogically some point over it. And I'm going to say that here's number 1, we must break through impossible barriers. So this is number 1. In other words, God is going to stick the impossible in front of us. That's how we start this process. And you say, what? So in other words, here's God who wants us to have a servant's heart. How does this begin? He's going to stick something impossible in front of you. How is God going to destroy the self or knock the self out of us? I don't know that that's true. So I have to back up and say, that's not true what I just said. He's not going to knock the self out of you. But how is God going to conquer the self? Or how is God going to help us get a grip on the self? How is God going to convince us that he is greater than the self? Help us deal with the self. He's going to put something impossible in front of us. So you might say, well, it's easy to serve the Lord. You know, we get it all backwards because we invert everything and get it all backwards. So you say, well, I'll just simply decide to do it. But how long will it be then until you decide, well, not to do it? You know, for example, remember we looked at 1 Kings 18 and verse 21, and right in there where Elijah is saying to the people of God, oh, how long are you gonna stagger between these, you know, if it's Baal or if it's the Lord, you know, that pasak, that Hebrew verb, you know, how long are you going to pass over? How long are you going to pass over between these two things, you know? And then the Haggai 2:4, you're dwelling in your beautiful houses while the house of the Lord. You know, the whole idea has to be with, you know, the decision making. You're indecisive. You're vacillating over this, you know. Well, am I going to be God's servant today or not? Am I going to have a servant's heart today or not? Am I going to live for me today? Am I going to live for God today? You know, kind of thing. And this got the nation of Israel in trouble all the time. And so this is an everyday kind of thing. But how is God going to teach us that? And here, how did he teach Joshua that he's going to put, so you have, in the book of Joshua, you basically have God teaching Joshua, and Joshua being kind of the exemplar, the one who actually ding, 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 you know, it resonates with, and he does, and he obeys these principles, and the people that failed, right? And so how does this sort of get through to Joshua? Puts something impossible in front of him, does the same thing for the people, yet they wouldn't adhere to these principles, but Joshua did. So to serve God, to really serve God, our self-life must end or die, and the power of God must work through us. And everybody understands that, and everybody talks about it, but yet, what will it take to convince you of that, or convince me of that? So God told Joshua to enter the promised land and to remove all of its occupants. He did this in Deuteronomy 31. He did this in the opening part of the book of Joshua. And God told Joshua that he had given the land and its people into his hand. This is what God told Joshua. What better promises could you ever want? Now, Joshua knew this intellectually, just like we know much intellectually. Now, he may have known this a little bit more. Interesting verse you might want to check out, Deuteronomy 34:9. You know, that the spirit of wisdom was upon Joshua because Moses laid his hands on him. That's an interesting verse. Play with that and see what you come up with. But Joshua, let's just say, he knew this intellectually, yet it was unproven to him experientially. Does that make sense? Because much of the Bible, we understand theologically, doctrinally, experientially, but it's yet to be what? Something that has been worked out practically in our own experience. So Joshua saw God work through Moses, but now Moses is dead and Joshua must lead the people. Now, how would God teach Joshua to trust him and not serve him in his own strength, or quit, or run, you know, at the first sight of an enemy? And he's going to see a lot of enemies, or rebel against God like the people would rebel. So God is going to put something impossible between Joshua and the promised land, which was the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate prize. So it's here that many believers settle for a powerless Christian life. You know, rather than meet that challenge, rather than say, right here, you know, I'm gonna take that step of faith, which is a literal one, right? With the priest dipping their feet in the edge of the Jordan and watching that, you know, completely irrational. Makes absolutely no sense, but that's the genius of God. He's not going to do it once, but he's going to do it twice. When you get done doing that, they're going to turn around, and what are you looking at? Jericho. How are you going to do that? Well, let's train these would-be whoever they are, you know, Joshua, and let's fashion some weapons for them, and Let's do our best. Maybe God will bless our efforts to attack them. Yeah, no, don't think so. How about you just march around it? Something like this, and blow some ram's horns, and then the walls will implode, and so on. So it's here. It's here that many Christians just say, yeah, I don't know. Now, but what happens? What happens? Rather than really put God to the test, if you will, and that's probably not a good way to phrase it, but rather than trust God and say, God, this is just an impossible situation. Why did you put me in this impossible situation? Yeah, it's because God wants to demonstrate to you, this is where it all begins. It begins right here. And this is just flat out the authentic, normal Christian life. It all begins right here. This is the entry point. This is a price of admission, so to speak, on discipleship, right here. This is where I can show you that it's not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit. Now, believers, many of them will just walk away from the impossible when they ought to just run headlong into it. Look at Joshua chapter 3 and verse 9, for example, where it says, Joshua said, by this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will assuredly dispossess from before. Now, this is what he's telling the people. So convinced is Joshua about all of this, but the people weren't. But he says, I want you to know, even as I know, the power of God, and that God is going to do this. Now, what happened when a step of faith was taken? God acted. I mean, this is just, unless and until this step of faith, God wasn't going to move. God wasn't going to act. So here's this step into the water, or Moses, Exodus 14:10, hold out that staff. Let the people remain silent. Hold out that staff. So if the nation had learned this lesson, this simple lesson, they would not have failed to drive out the inhabitants being powerless. For example, you look at chapter 15, verse 63, chapter 16, verse 10, chapter 17, and verse 12. Powerless did not drive out all the inhabitants, and it all came back to haunt them. So what did Joshua do that the nation did not? Now that's an interesting dichotomy in the book. What did Joshua do that the nation did not? So I'd say four things. One, he trusted in the nature of God. So he trusted, this is capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. So he had a firm grasp on God as being this, the God of the covenant. How much did he know about God? You think about how much we know about God. He didn't know a thimble about God, except this was the covenant-keeping God, the creator God. What is it that God could not do? A God that would stand by his word. But he trusted in the nature of God. Secondly, he acted on the promises of God. God had given him these promises. Wherever the sole of your foot would land, it's yours. I will fight for you. 3, he obeyed the commands of God. And so he acted. Then he obeyed. He expected, number 4, he expected the power of God, right? So it wasn't that he trusted in his own power. He trusted in the somehow the military might that he possessed, his own resources, but he expected the power of God to be manifested to meet the challenges. So this pattern is repeated when Joshua defeated Jericho by marching around the walls and blowing horns. So this is a systemic kind of thing. So true servants of the living God do not fear impossible circumstances. You could find this repeated again and again and again and again. If you look, for example, you can look many places, but 1 Samuel, if you want another passage, 1 Samuel 17, 45 to 47. And you remember the case where here is David, this young shepherd, right? And he goes up against the Philistine giant. And then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day, like, you just have to imagine this. You just have to imagine the scene. You know, we have the Sunday school flannel graph, if you remember what that is. Well, we have this Sunday school kind of image of this, you know, the Crayola, you know, watercolor version of this. But you have to imagine. I mean, and then just sort of take this anecdotally maybe to think of whatever the situation is in your life, whatever the impossible, you know, the constraints of the impossible. Maybe it's finances, maybe who knows what it is that God, you know, has put you in, that whatever the situation, you have to trust God for somehow, and trust God that, you know, that he is sufficient for these things. I don't know. But, you know, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I think of this in terms of, I think the ultimate thing in terms of the relativity of this to the next step that we'll see is dealing with sin in your life. This is the most critical matter. Is enough believers don't say this very thing to the presence of sin in their life. And instead of saying, hey, sin shall not have lorded over me. You know, this is 6:14 of Romans. And just say, no, God has given you into my hand. You're not going to lord it over me. I will strike you down. This kind of thing. So anyway, but what does it say? And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and will give you into. That's the whole point. That's the whole point, that the nations may know that there's somehow through us. Why? Why does God want us to have a servant's heart anyway? What's the whole point? You have to always be asking this. What is the point? The point. It's always a missional outcome. It's not just for our personal edification. The whole point is that the nations may know. This is J. Hudson Taylor, right? China Inland Mission, the 1865. Hudson Taylor, he said, well, every work of God has three stages, you know, and it always the impossible, the difficult, and the done. That's just how it starts, and then you no more start to do this cycle once again. So the impossible, expect the impossible. And I just have to say this quickly. So there is no step 2 without getting through step 1. So it isn't like, I'll pick and choose which steps, and then so a lot of people just say, well, you know, I'll just have this servant's heart. I don't have to deal with this impossible thing, and then I only have to deal with these other. No. See, we're getting to the fourth step, which is having a servant's heart, but you're not going to have it unless the self is conquered. You don't conquer the self unless you face something that's going to defeat it. And you're going to have to do this enough times until you're absolutely convinced that you bring absolutely zero into this equation with God. It's just like our salvation, right? I brought zero into this equation with it. I brought zero. I have nothing of myself, nothing. And so why would I think that I'm going to live the Christian life on some other terms? You know, so I would expect then that I just show up. But how am I going to become convinced of that? How is it that God is going to demonstrate to me that his power is sufficient? So secondly, just try to move it along, is to fight battles until the victory is achieved. So once you get through that and God convinces you that his power is sufficient, then what are you going to do with that power? What's the point? Wow, God, that was pretty cool. That was really amazing how you stood the waters up. That was really amazing when we saw the walls of Jericho, you know, implode. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do for an encore? You know. So the whole point is then that the reason what you're supposed to dispossess, you're supposed to do my will, and that is to dispossess the people of the land. I'm just trying to demonstrate to you that you're not going to do it by your own power, but you're going to do it by my power. Now just get on with doing it. You're going to have to fight. You're going to have to get out there and go to war and do the battle, but you're going to defeat the enemy by my power. But you are going to defeat the enemy. You are going to do my will and do all of it. No compromise. So fight battles until the victory is achieved. Now, we're not talking about sinless perfectionism here, but we're talking about that no sin will lord it over us. You know, the idea is that God has given us the ability to conquer sin and not to let any sin get entrenched in our life. And so I'd say this is chapter 5 and verse 13 through chapter 12 and verse 24, where they are fighting all of these battles. And Joshua had the heart of a warrior. Here's just a verse that I think is pretty cool. But chapter 5 and verse 13. Remember, here's this thing where he sees this this man with a sword drawn, this angelic figure with a sword drawn, and he says, and it's just this one phrase. I think it's just, you can intonate it however you want, and I have my way of doing it. But he says, are you for us or for our adversaries? Now Joshua, I think Joshua's just going to take him out right here. I really do. Because if he's for our adversaries, he's done. This guy's done. This is amazing. See, this is the heart of a warrior, and that's Joshua. You know, Joshua is just bent on doing one thing and one thing alone, and that is fulfilling the will of God. He is in fighting mode all the time. That's Joshua. Now, I know there's other things going on in this passage, but I'm just saying the reason for the question. Now, Ephesians 6:10, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to, right? So here's this from Paul. What? We're supposed to be doing this constantly. Be in battle mode, be battle ready. Now Joshua knew the land needed to be free from all inhabitants, and he won every battle. You look at Joshua chapter 11 and verse 23, you know, thus the land had rest from war. Outside of that situation with the Gibeonites, this was Joshua fulfilling what he was commanded to do. So the spiritual comparison is Romans 6:14. For sin shall not lord it over you or have dominion over you. And there are other places like Romans 7:25 that we have the victory through Christ. 1 Corinthians 15:57. But this was not true of the people who had compromised, and we see this in, for example, in other places, but in chapter 18, in verse 3, where Joshua said to the sons of Israel, "How long will you put off entering to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?" So we have a contrast in the book between Joshua, who was God's servant, who was living by God's power, and the people who were living by their own power. And all the while, looming sort of on the horizon, was chapter 4 and verses 22 and 23, where they erected these 12 stones that they took from the midst of the Jordan, which was the scene of that manifestation of God's power through those to that generation, that they might not forget the source of that power to remind them. A third principle, and again, that's assuming that you've gotten this far on the journey. That's assuming that you've faced the impossible, been convinced to live by God's power, that you're fighting these battles and being successful. That's assuming that those things are taking place. That's assuming that you're living that intentionally. Then you get to the third point. And the third point in the book, I mean, what's the purpose, is to organize your life according to God's plan. So this is Joshua 13, chapter 1 through 21:45. This was where they were to divide the land according to tribal allotments. So you have this sense spiritually of this idea of organizing according to God's plan. So it's time now for the people of Israel to settle the land. Each tribe is given borders to occupy, but there's a problem. The people had not completely removed the inhabitants from the land. And you see this, for example, in Joshua chapter 15 and verse 63. Now, as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out. And this becomes a repeated refrain. Chapter 16 and verse 10. But they did not drive out. So could not, did not drive out the Canaanites. And then 17 and verse 12. But they did not drive them out completely. Chapter 18 and verse 3, which we just read a moment ago. By now, they should trust the power of God. By now, they should win every battle. By now, they should be at rest within their borders. By now, they should be ready to serve God. That is, they should be positioning themselves for a life of offering themselves in service to God. And you can see how this works. I mean, it makes perfect sense. You're in a position where you're convinced that God's power is the only means available to live a life that pleases Him. Second, you're to utilize that power to destroy anything that's in competition with Him in your life. Third, then you're to organize your life in such a way that it's made available exclusively to Him. And if you work it backwards, you say, wow, I can't possibly organize my life in such a way that it's exclusively available to Him because I have too many right? And then you look at the final chapter where Joshua says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Why? Because Joshua did 1, 2, and 3. It was, we're ready, we're available, but the people of God couldn't because there were too many things that had to be removed. So this becomes the chronic issue going forward with the people of Israel. So the parallel in the Christian life is that the believer should be surrendered and dead to self. Now this is Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. That you present your bodies as a sacrifice. That is, it's living, but it's sacrifice. It's offered. And the idea that what is offered then, what is offered is something then that God can take and use. This is the idea. That's one. Two is a believer should conquer sin when temptation comes. That battle never ends. Paul goes to great length in Romans chapter 7. So, it could be a big controversy over whether he's talking about if that's the life of a believer or not. I happen to believe it is and can go to great lengths to convince you about that. But Romans 6:14, for sin shall not have dominion over you, but the believer should conquer sin when temptation comes. But the idea that there's an ongoing struggle and an ongoing battle, if you understand fundamentally who the I is, who Paul is talking about when he says I, uses the first person. Who is the I in that self that is waging this war and waging this battle? Then you get the idea that it is a constant ongoing struggle. And the idea is not that they were going to become sinless, but the idea is that we are victorious. So we have to understand that, which means that we are not going to, our goal is not that we're going to somehow eradicate sin from our life. So we're not going to do that. We know that. But that doesn't mean we say, oh, I just can't beat this thing. Now that would be totally unscriptural, because sin shall not, we have to really grab a hold of 6:14. Sin shall not lord it over us means no sin has the power to get a hold of us. We can break the bondage of that, and in fact, that's what we must do. And so we're just trying to give a picture here of saying, I offer myself, God takes it, we're convinced that his power is sufficient to then conquer anything that opposes the life of God in us, the will of God to be accomplished in us, all of those things, right? And then 3, the believer should live in harmony with the Spirit's influence. And we just take a passage like Galatians 5:25, where we have that, that analogy of keep in step with the Spirit. Means, walk in wherever you see the footprint in the snow, just step there. Keep in step, keep in harmony. So if we live in the Spirit, we should keep in step with the Spirit. This is basically what is said here. Or 1 John 2:6, if you like that as well. Those that claim to know Jesus should walk as he walked. Then, with all that being said, then with those first three things in order, keep in mind this is what Joshua did, and Joshua followed it to a T. He's quite an example to emulate, Joshua. For God will be first in your life, and you will serve him with all your heart. This is Joshua. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And you look at this is what God expected. This is Deuteronomy 6:4-6, the Shema in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and this is Matthew 22 and Mark chapter 12, as well as Jesus repeats this. So the people still had work to do. They were still hanging on to, and if you're looking at Joshua chapter 24, therefore put away the foreign gods which are in your midst and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. They're still clinging to these things, still holding on to these things that they had to throw away. So to get to that point where we have a servant's heart, not that we're serving, because this is where everything gets all out of order. People say, oh, okay, what do I do? I'm going to go serve the Lord. I'm going to go serve. But yet that's just doing, and their heart isn't there. So it's all completely out of order. It's all out of whack, and it's all over the place like that. All this doing, which makes Christianity kind of a weird thing, just a bunch of stuff like that. But where's the heart in this, right? And so think we can't offer to God. We can't offer to God something that is already filled. Like so you can't. We're saying throw this away. The idea is to live this surrendered life, but what do we really have here? Is this sense of offering something that is voided. And you see what does it take to void that out, to void the self? You realize how kind of difficult that is. And how that God works to bring that about in our lives, putting these life circumstances that cause great internal conflict, because it forces us to come to terms with our own personality, just deep within our personality. And it unnerves us, because it points out our true weakness to the core of our being. And we have to come to terms and say, this is this is totally beyond me in every sense of the terms. And we have to say it's either God or I'm just lost here. I can't do this. And we finally recognize that really God is enough. God is absolutely sufficient. And the only peace we have is the sense that I can trust him completely. So you look at a passage like John chapter 10 and verse 10, where Jesus says, well, the thief, speaking of Satan, the adversary who just wants us to do the opposite, well, he comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. But Jesus says, well, I've come that you might have life, but that you might have it, and then the adverb of this periso is the Greek verb, but you might have it abundantly, that you might have it abundantly, but that's sort of on us, right? You have life, you have new life, but you have it abundantly. Now, I want to see where this verse, or where this verb appears also, and then we finish. It's Romans 15:13. I think these two verses go together so well for all of the disaffected people, right? So Romans 15 and 13, now may the Lord of hope fill you with all joy and peace. So if you want to know what hope is, this affection, what is this hope? What is this sense? It's a sense of joy and peace. So here's the fullness, this experience of hope within your being that captivates you. And what is the affective quality of that? No, give me a definition of hope. But what is the affective quality of that? Joy and peace. Imagine that. Imagine being able to trade all the anxiety, all the nonsense, right? And to have your self, instead of being, it's not going to come out right. Instead of being full of yourself, which is what? Full of anxiety, full of just anything, could be full of pride, full of, I don't know what all those disaffections are. But then having that voided, and in its place, just being captivated with a sense of joy and peace. This is it right here. But he says, now this is what this is in Greek, it's an optative mood. So Paul is really wishing this on them. It's like he's calling upon them to have this happen. Just let it happen. I want this for you. In believing. So it has to do with trust. How do you get somebody to trust God implicitly? By intellectually convincing them? You got to slap something impossible in front of them. You're never going to intellectually get somebody to, how are you going to convince them? But so that you will, now here is our periso. It's an infinitive of purpose now here. So that you will abound, or you will to have an overflow of abundance in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So what is this saying? What's this whole verse saying is that it is this trusting implicitly in God that pops the cork off of this flow of joy and peace into your life. But the minute you trust in yourself, the minute it's all about you, you just put a cork on all of that. And all this hope and all the joy and all the peace just goes away. So this is the idea of Josh was saying, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. And here's a person this is the Hebrews 4. This is the rest. This is the whole intention of the promised land. This is the rest that you have. This is a sense of complete trust in God. And why we would settle for anything less than that. But we got to hasten Jason, as my grandfather used to say. Lord, thank you for opportunity to spend some moments in your word. Thank you for the truth that comes with having a servant's heart and trusting you. And I pray that can be just more than some rapidly spoken words this morning, but we could take it to heart, take it with us throughout the day, throughout the week, embed it in our spirit, and just rehearse it again and again and again in our minds. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.